On this week's episode of Whitetail Cribs, we're headed back to Southern Ohio to visit with Mike Rex. Mike is the former president of the Buckeye Big Buck Club. Mike has 20 bucks in the record books over 140 inches and a giant 216-inch whitetail. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Now let's go to get in the video.
Hello, I'm Mike Rex and welcome to my house. Fellas, come on upstairs here. I'll show you our trophy room. Well, I'm past president of the Buckeye Big Buck Club. I'm currently the secretary, treasurer, records chairman. I've been active in the Buckeye Big Buck Club for about 27 years. That's sort of our benchmark. When we target a deer, we like to hopefully think that it's going to make Buckeye Big Buck, which is 140 typical, 160 non-typical. So that's sort of what we're shooting for. There are 40 plus Buckeye Big Buck Club qualifiers in this room. Most of them were taken with archery equipment, a handful of them with a gun. The first one was taken, this buck, in 1991. The last one was taken, this buck behind you, in 2020. All by myself and then my three sons. This is a deer I called the Teflon Don. This deer was 8.5 years old and wound up getting him by sheer luck, but my sons had hunted him before me, and then I wound up killing him in 2013, and he was really sharp. He was really unusual. He didn't do things he wasn't supposed to. He couldn't really, the way I wanted to hunt him, the way I like to hunt him, he wouldn't fall for it, and so it just took a little bit of luck and perseverance to wind up getting him within bow range, but I probably have as much respect for him as any deer that I've ever hunted. All right, so we have our three most memorable hunts are hanging on the wall downstairs in our den. We'll go down and talk about those. All right, so the first deer I want to talk about is this deer. He nets in the 170s. Actually, he had a broken brow tine. I had a taxidermist repair it after the 60-day drying period, after he would be officially scored. But he's special because of where he was killed. This deer was really kind of interesting. We had about 3 years history with him, and he was one of those deer that with trail cameras we could kind of keep tabs on him. And he would start the late summer, early fall in an area north of here, and it was an area that I wasn't allowed to hunt, but a friend of mine could hunt. He would get pictures of him and had gotten pictures of him for a couple of years in that area. Then he would sort of, for lack of a better word, migrate, and he would start to move south as the winter progressed. And the middle ground where he is actually his range or home range, whatever you would like to call it, was on public property. And so really my best opportunity to hunt him was on Wayne National Forest on public property. So spent about 6 weeks almost every day hanging in a tree on Wayne National Forest, and really mature timber. Had to climb really high up in the air to get into any cover whatsoever. Lots of other people hunting around me. That year we had an early snow. We had a snow on like the 10th of November, which for this part of the country is kind of unusual. So I felt like I needed to get in early that day. So I got in, I was actually sitting down. It was about a 20-minute walk to where I was hunting. I was sitting down an hour and a half before daylight. And in that hour and a half span, I had 5 different flashlights come by me in the dark, 20 minutes back into the Wayne National Forest. So I wasn't alone back there. And I had trail cameras up all over the place, which one of the things is some people I think are afraid to put up trail cameras on public property, afraid of being stolen. My experience has been kind of different in that most of the people that hunt public ground in this area are non-residents, come from out of the area. And in my experience, non-residents tend to be more serious about it than the locals do, just because if you travel to hunt, you're pretty serious about it. And nobody ever bothered my stuff. Nobody ever bothered my cameras, my tree stands, anything. I think a lot of people would be afraid to leave trail cameras in public areas like that, but I didn't, and nobody ever messed with it. And unfortunately, I would only get his picture maybe once a week, but it was just enough to keep me interested, keep me confident that he's still above ground, he's still huntable. And so anyway, I wound up killing him on December the 5th, which was kind of a big deal. Like I said, I had a lot of time invested in him. The next buck is by far the biggest buck in the house. He's really unique in that he's 24 inches inside. His brow tines, one of his brow tines is almost 15 inches. The other one's 14 inches. His typical frame's 200 inches. I've had him on display with the biggest bucks in the world, and he doesn't look out of place. I mean, you can put him with the very biggest bucks ever killed, and you're like, what the hell's that thing doing up there? I mean, you know, he sort of blends in with them. For this area, he's really unique deer. I mean, this is a good hunting area as far as the Midwestern Ohio goes, but there are better areas of Ohio for really top-end quality bucks. He's the largest buck in the history of this county by 20 inches. If you just took his 4-point typical frame, just his brow tines and his main beams, and you gave him 4 circumference measurements, he would make Buckeye Big Buck as a 4-point. So kind of a unique deer. And I had about 2.5 years of my life into hunting him. Myself and my boys had an area where we could hunt all to ourselves. We didn't own the ground, but an elderly couple that we've been friends with for years gave us permission, exclusive permission. Then we had permission on another piece of ground where it was shared permission. Then there were 3 other guys that I all knew that all had reconnaissance on the deer. They all had trail cameras, and one friend of mine had actually shot him the year before, clipped hair off the top of his back. But it was quite an adventure. I killed him the opening morning of the 2005 season. I did not have him pinned down that year either. It was a year sort of like this year. We had lots of mass, lots of hard mass, lots of acorns. And so the deer in this area, this is mostly wooded, the deer weren't real patternable. They were sort of spread out. But one thing we did have going on that year is we had no rain. It was real dry. We had 57 days of no rain in July, August, and part of in September. And so water was important. It was the only year I can ever remember hunting where water sources in this area really meant something. And I was hunting where there was a water source below me, and I was on an oak flat leading to a creek that wasn't flowing, but it had puddles. And actually the hunt, a very memorable hunt. So it's opening morning of bow season, it's October 1st, and I overslept. And my wife, who's really not an avid hunter, but woke me up and said, boy, you're not going to go hunting today? All you've been doing all summer is, worried about this deer. And I thought, okay, I'll go. So it broad daylight, I went, got in a tree stand, and I'd been sitting there maybe half hour or so, and I saw a doe and 2 yearlings come down a hardwood flat in front of me. And they got about 50 yards out in front of me, and they looked over the bank, and there was a puddle in that creek where the deer had been drinking. And they walked over the bank, and the mom went over the bank, and the 2 yearlings followed him. About a half hour after that, on out the flat, and it's October 1st, so it's still, even though it's an open hardwoods, there's a lot of foliage and it's hard to see. I can see antlers off in the distance, and I saw antlers here, and I saw antlers here. And my first thought was, it's 2 bucks getting ready to square off, or getting ready to spar. And all of a sudden it starts coming towards me, and I realize it's one deer. And he's walking right at me. So he comes right down the flat, follows the exact trail that the doe and the 2 yearlings were on, and he stops right where they stopped. And I remember thinking in my mind, oh, he's going to walk over the bank down to that puddle and walk out of my life. And he stood there for a second. He even looked over the bank down to where those deer were. And then he just wagged his tail and came right towards me. And he got about 25 yards away from me, and something, I don't know if an acorn fell or something, but he was actually facing me. And he heard a noise, he stopped, and he turned and looked the opposite direction and just opened up that pocket 25 yards. And so anyway, I shot him, and there might have been glow knocks at the time, but I didn't have them. But I was shooting white crested arrows that looked kind of like a laser. And I saw the arrow disappear in his chest, so I felt really good about the shot. And I'd had a lot of time at 2.5 years and invested in this buck to think about what I would do. So first thing I did is I got down out of the stand. I didn't go after him. I went and got our wildlife officer, our county game warden. Brought him back with me, showed him, there's my stand, there's my arrow. And the wildlife officer actually started helping me track him. He found the deer. But he tells a funny story. He said, Mike, he said, when you came down my driveway that morning, he said, his driveway was a pretty long gravel driveway, maybe a third of a mile, quarter of a mile driveway. He said, you were going well over the speed limit. He said, and when you got out of your car, he said, you were clicking your heels like a leprechaun. He said, you were jumping up and down. He said, I knew something really exciting had happened. So anyway, that was quite a big deal. But again, 2.5 years of my life tied up into that deer. So probably I want to say the most effort, the most sought after buck in my house, my oldest son Ryan killed when he was 16 years old. And this deer, he's been featured in North American Whitetail magazine back in 2010, I guess. My son killed him January the 29th of 2009. This deer, and we spoke about this earlier, but I'll tell you the story again. This deer really knew he was being pursued. He lived in an area mostly public hunting. He lived close to town. He routinely crossed a 5-lane road to get to the Hocking River, to get to water. There was an area where there was a high wall, a third of a mile long, and it had 2 cuts in it where the deer could traverse up and down. We had wireless trail cameras at the head of both of those drainages, and over 100 times over the course of the 2008-2009 season, that deer came down that cut where we got a picture of him coming down the cut. They were all after dark. The cut ran east and west, so anything, north, obviously the wind was behind him, south, the wind was in his face. I went back and I charted on an Excel spreadsheet the weather data for that time period when we had those pictures. And the deer came down off the rock an average of 2.5 hours earlier when the wind was in his face, or 2.5 hours later when the wind was at his back, and it was all after dark. So even under the cover of darkness, he would not come down off that rock unless he was 100% sure that there was no danger down there below him, or it was safe to come down. It's just a really interesting deer. My son, my oldest son Ryan, wound up killing him during a level 3 ice storm snow emergency, and it was quite a special hunt. I'll never forget this part also. So, like a lot of serious deer hunters, we don't tell everybody exactly where we hunt. I mean, we don't hunt illegally, we don't trespass, but nothing good comes from, lots of people knowing where you are, what you're doing, especially if you have a reputation for killing good deer, right? Because, oh, well, so-and-so's there, it must be a big one in there, right? So my youngest son, he was 14 at the time, and myself and one of my best buddies and my 2 boys were standing over this deer while he's laying there in the snow, and it was kind of an emotional experience because we had so much effort into hunting him. And of course my son wound up killing him, and it was really kind of emotional. And my youngest son looked at me and he said, "Dad," he goes, "where are we going to tell everybody this deer died?" And I said, "If any of your buddies ask you, tell them he was killed at the intersection of hard work and perseverance, right where those 2 roads cross." I thought that was kind of good. So anyway, but yeah, that deer, the sticker time buck, he was probably the most sought after of all the trophies that we have. So fellas, that's the deer, the trophy wall, the trophy room in the Rex household. Appreciate you coming by. Stop back anytime.